It happened on a Tuesday afternoon in 1958, somewhere on the wide stretch of 7th Avenue in Harlem, where the traffic moved slow and the sidewalks moved slower, and everyone who was anyone knew to watch their step. A young man, 23 years old, fresh from La Grange, North Carolina, maybe 2 or 3 years into his Harlem education, did something that men in that neighborhood spent their entire lives carefully avoiding. He put his hands on the wife of Ellsworth Mayme Johnson. The young man's name was Frank Lucas, and in the years to come, he would become one of the most infamous drug kingpins in American history, the subject of federal investigations, congressional testimony, and eventually a major Hollywood film. He would build an empire that imported heroin directly from Southeast Asia, bypassing the Italian mob's distribution network entirely. He would dress in chinchilla fur coats and sit courtside at Madison Square Garden. He would, by his own later account, earn more money in a single week than most people earned in their entire lives. But in 1958, Frank Lucas was still becoming. He was still a young man who had not yet learned the most fundamental lesson of Harlem's underworld, that certain lines, once crossed, could not be uncrossed, that certain men existed in the landscape of the city not merely as criminals, but as institutions, and that touching an institution's family was not a crime you committed and walked away from. What exactly happened on that 7th Avenue sidewalk has been told in different versions by different people over the decades. The specific nature of the altercation, whether Lucas shoved Mayme Johnson, grabbed her arm, spoke to her in a way that crossed the unspoken boundaries of the street, has never been precisely documented in any official record. What has been documented in the oral history of Harlem and in the accounts of people who lived through those years is the essential fact. Frank Lucas laid hands on Bumpy Johnson's wife, and Bumpy Johnson found out. What happened next is the kind of story that doesn't make it into police reports because it was never intended to. It is the kind of story that lived in barbershops, in church basements, in the apartments of old men who had watched Harlem transform itself through 5 different decades and remembered everything. The response was not immediate, loud, or theatrical. There were no screaming confrontations in public. No guns drawn in broad daylight on 7th Avenue. Nothing that would give the police department's 28th precinct an excuse to intervene. What happened was quieter than that. And quieter, in Harlem's particular grammar of power, meant something far more serious. By the time the consequences fully landed, Frank Lucas would understand something that no amount of ambition and no quantity of street courage could have taught him in advance. That Bumpy Johnson was not merely a criminal boss. He was the order underneath the chaos. He was the reason certain things in Harlem happened the way they happened, and certain things did not happen at all. And no one, not the Italian mob, not the NYPD, not the federal government, and certainly not a 23-year-old from North Carolina, touched what was his without paying a price that was calculated very carefully by the man himself. To understand what that price was, and why Frank Lucas spent the rest of his life simultaneously terrified of and devoted to the memory of Ellsworth Johnson, you have to understand where both men came from. You have to understand the Harlem they met in, the world that shaped them, and the extraordinary chain of events that turned a dangerous young stranger into the most famous student Bumpy Johnson ever taught. By 1950, Harlem was simultaneously the cultural capital of Black America and one of the most economically distressed urban neighborhoods in the United States. The contradiction was not accidental. It was the product of specific policies, specific decisions, and specific forms of exclusion that had been building for 3 decades. The Great Migration had brought hundreds of thousands of Black Americans to New York City between 1910 and 1940, and Harlem had absorbed them. The neighborhood's cultural output during those years, the Harlem Renaissance, the jazz clubs on 52nd Street and 125th, the literary magazines and the political organizations and the churches that functioned as community anchors, was genuinely extraordinary. Duke Ellington, Langston Hughes, the Apollo Theater, the Savoy Ballroom, These were world historical cultural institutions that happened to be concentrated in a 40-block stretch of Upper Manhattan. At the same time, the economic reality for most Harlem residents was brutal. Redlining, the practice by which banks and the federal government officially designated black neighborhoods as ineligible for mortgage loans and investment, had been national policy since the 1930s. The Federal Housing Administration, created in 1934, explicitly excluded black neighborhoods from its mortgage insurance programs. White families were building equity in suburban homes. Black families in Harlem were renting overcrowded apartments from landlords who faced no competition for their business. Unemployment in Harlem during the 1950s ran consistently higher than the citywide average, often by a factor of 2 or 3. The manufacturing jobs that had drawn black workers north during the war years were disappearing as factories automated and moved out of the city. The professional and white-collar jobs that were replacing them were largely inaccessible to black applicants who faced discrimination at every level of the hiring process. Into this economic reality, the underground economy was not an aberration. It was a necessity. The numbers game, as we have seen in earlier stories, generated millions of dollars annually in Harlem. Money that circulated within the community, employed local people, and provided a financial safety net for families that had no other access to credit or insurance. The men and women who ran policy operations were, in the specific economic logic of Harlem, doing something that banks and employers refused to do. They were keeping resources inside the neighborhood. Bumpy Johnson stood at the apex of this system by the mid-1950s. He had survived 2 significant prison terms, had negotiated a territorial arrangement with Italian organized crime that preserved Harlem's economic autonomy to a significant degree, and had built a reputation as a man who could be trusted to hold the line between order and chaos in a neighborhood that had very few official mechanisms for maintaining either. He was, by 1955, one of the most recognized men in Harlem. He ate at Wells Restaurant on 7th Avenue and 131st Street, where he held court with politicians, musicians, boxers, and community leaders. He was photographed with Sugar Ray Robinson. He knew Adam Clayton Powell, Jr., Harlem's congressional representative, and moved in the complicated, overlapping world where community leadership and criminal enterprise were never as cleanly separated as the official version of events prefer to suggest. He was also, by 1955, a man who had spent decades earning a specific kind of respect, the kind that is maintained not through constant displays of force, but through the consistent demonstration that certain things in your world are immovable. His family was one of those things. And then Frank Lucas arrived. Or rather, Frank Lucas had been arriving for several years already, in the way that ambitious young men from the South arrived in Harlem throughout the 1940s and 1950s, quietly, determinately, watching everything and learning the rules of a game they intended to win. Frank Lucas was born on September 9th, 1930, in La Grange, North Carolina. His childhood, by his own later account, was shaped by an act of racial violence that occurred when he was very young, an incident involving a family member and white men that left a permanent mark on his understanding of the world and the rules by which it operated. He grew up in a South where the law was explicitly an instrument of racial terror, where black men had no recourse against white violence, and where survival required either submission or the development of a different kind of calculation entirely. Lucas chose the calculation. He arrived in Harlem in the late 1940s, somewhere between 16 and 18 years old. Accounts differ on the exact year. He had been in trouble in North Carolina, and New York represented both escape and opportunity. What he found in Harlem was a world of extraordinary complexity, a neighborhood that had developed its own internal hierarchies, its own codes of conduct, its own economy, and its own version of justice. He was not immediately successful. The early years in Harlem were years of observation and small-scale schemes, of learning who held what territory and why, of developing the specific skill set that the underground economy rewarded. The ability to assess risk accurately, to keep one's word, to read people's real intentions rather than their stated ones. By the mid-1950s, Frank Lucas had caught the attention of people in Harlem's underworld who recognized in him the particular quality that separated the merely dangerous from the genuinely capable. He was ambitious without being reckless, or so it seemed. He was willing to work hard and wait for the right moment. He had the kind of physical presence that discouraged casual challenges, combined with an intelligence that made men who underestimated him regret the oversight. It was this combination of qualities, the physical authority, the strategic intelligence, the sheer determined hunger to become something, that eventually brought him to the orbit of Ellsworth Johnson. The specific circumstances of how Frank Lucas first encountered Bumpy Johnson are, like so much of this story, told differently in different accounts. Lucas himself, in interviews conducted years later, described meeting Bumpy Johnson early in his Harlem years and being immediately struck by the man's presence. Not the theatrical presence of a man performing power, but the settled, interior authority of someone who had already decided who he was and had never needed to reconsider. What is consistent across accounts is that by the mid-1950s, Frank Lucas was working for, or closely associated with, Ellsworth Johnson's organization. The nature of that relationship, whether Lucas was a lieutenant, an enforcer, a driver, or something more informal, has been described differently by different sources. What seems clear is that Lucas was learning from Bumpy Johnson in the way that very few young men were privileged to learn, by proximity to a man who understood the entire ecosystem of organized crime in New York, from the street level up to the Italian families who nominally presided over it. Bumpy Johnson was, by multiple accounts, a man who liked intelligent young people around him. He had a habit of testing the people he worked with, not through manufactured crises, but through the everyday demands of navigating complex situations without explicit instruction. Could you read a room? Could you hold your tongue when holding it was more powerful than speaking? Could you make the right call when there was no right call, only the least bad option? Frank Lucas, according to later accounts, passed these tests consistently, which made what happened on 7th Avenue in 1958 not just a crime of impulse, but something that disturbed the very logic of the relationship that had been developing between them. How could a man smart enough to learn everything Bumpy Johnson had to teach him be stupid enough to do the one thing that no amount of intelligence could justify? The answer, as it usually is in these stories, lives somewhere in the gap between what a person knows and what they do in a moment of anger. Before we can understand what the incident on 7th Avenue meant, we have to understand who Mayme Johnson was. Mayme Johnson was not a woman who occupied the background of Bumpy Johnson's life. She was, by all accounts, a fully realized person in her own right, educated, sharp, socially connected in a Harlem that valued all three qualities. She had met Bumpy Johnson in the 1940s, and their relationship was, by the complex standards of the world they lived in, a genuine partnership. Mayme understood exactly who and what Bumpy was. She was not naive about the criminal enterprise that provided the financial foundation of their life. She was also, in the way of many women married to men in Bumpy's position, the more publicly respectable face of the household, the one who attended church, who engaged with Harlem's civic and social organizations, who maintained the relationships with the neighborhood's legitimate community that Bumpy's criminal profile made complicated for him to maintain directly. She was known and respected throughout Harlem. People who didn't know Bumpy personally knew Mayme, and people who knew both understood that touching Mayme Johnson was, in every possible sense, the most dangerous thing a person could do in that neighborhood. The specific details of the 1958 incident remain, as I noted, contested. Frank Lucas, in later interviews, acknowledged that a confrontation occurred, but offered a version that minimized the physical nature of what happened. Other accounts, drawn from people who claimed proximity to the events, describe something more serious, a grab, a shove, a physical act of disrespect that was unambiguous in its meaning. What all accounts agree on is the context. Lucas was angry about something. The exact source of his anger, whether it was a business dispute, a personal slight, a misunderstanding that had escalated, has been described differently in different tellings. But anger, in Harlem's power structure, was not an excuse that carried weight at any level. You did not express your anger through a man's wife. That was not a rule that required extensive elaboration. Word reached Bumpy Johnson within hours. This is one of the facts about which there is no ambiguity. Harlem in the 1950s was a place where information moved extraordinarily fast through informal networks. The numbers runners, the barbers, the doormen, the churchwomen, the block captains who knew everything and told the right people selectively. If anything happened to anyone connected to Bumpy Johnson anywhere in a 40-block radius, Bumpy Johnson would know about it before the sun moved an hour across the sky. By the accounts of people who were present in the circles around Bumpy during those hours, his initial reaction was not the explosive fury that outsiders might have expected. It was something colder, more deliberate. One account, repeated across multiple sources, has Bumpy sitting quietly for several minutes after receiving the report. Not speaking, not moving, just sitting with the information and letting it become something in his mind before it became anything in the world. When he finally spoke, he reportedly said something simple. Something that, in the specific language of his world, translated with absolute precision. He said, "Find him." 2 words. No elaboration. No specification of what was to happen when Frank Lucas was found, because no elaboration was necessary. Everyone in that room understood what "find him" meant when it came from Ellsworth Johnson in that particular tone of voice. Now here's where the story takes its first real turn, because what happened next was not what anyone expected. If you've been following along with this series, you know that I don't sensationalize what I'm about to tell you. The history speaks for itself. So before I continue, if stories like this one are why you're here, take a second and subscribe. We go deep on the real histories that most people only know as myths. Now, back to Bumpy Johnson and the decision that changed everything. Frank Lucas was found. In the accounts that have accumulated around this story over the decades, the finding did not take long. Lucas was not hiding. He may not have fully understood, in the immediate aftermath of the 7th Avenue incident, the magnitude of what he had done. Or perhaps he understood it perfectly and had decided that running would be an admission of fear that was worse than facing the consequences. Either way, he was brought before Bumpy Johnson. The setting for this confrontation, wherever it occurred, and accounts differ on the location, was not a warehouse, not a back alley. It was by most accounts a relatively ordinary interior space, an apartment, a back room, somewhere indoors and private. The deliberateness of the setting was itself a communication. This was not going to be a street confrontation, public and theatrical. This was going to be a conversation, and conversations of this kind, in Bumpy Johnson's world, had a specific shape. What Bumpy Johnson said to Frank Lucas in that room has been recounted by Lucas himself in different interviews over the years, with varying levels of detail. The emotional core of what Lucas described consistently was this: he had never in his life been more frightened than he was in that room. This is significant because Frank Lucas was not a man who frightened easily. By 1958, he had already navigated years of Harlem street life, had dealt with men who use violence as a primary tool of communication, and had developed the specific psychological armor that survival in that world required. Fear was not a new experience for him. But what Bumpy Johnson did in that room was something qualitatively different from the physical threat that Lucas had prepared himself for. There was no screaming. There were no weapons drawn. There was no performance of fury designed to intimidate through spectacle. What there was, by Lucas's own account, was clarity. Bumpy spoke to him about what he had done. Not about Mayme specifically, or not only about Mayme, but about the deeper logic of what the action meant. He spoke about what it meant to put hands on a woman, He spoke about what it meant to disrespect the family of a man who had, in his own estimation, shown Lucas nothing but opportunity and instruction. And then, and this is the twist that makes the story something other than a simple tale of criminal retribution. Bumpy Johnson did not have Frank Lucas killed. He did not have him badly beaten in a way that criminal organizations routinely enforce discipline. He did not exile him from Harlem, which would have been a death sentence for Lucas's ambitions. He did not do any of the things that the logic of his world and the severity of the offense would have fully justified. What Bumpy Johnson did was make Frank Lucas understand exactly what he had done and exactly what it had cost him, not in blood or bones, but in the currency that Bumpy Johnson dealt in most fluently, knowledge of one's own smallness in the face of a larger order. The specific consequences that followed, the social and professional isolation that Lucas reportedly experienced in certain Harlem circles for a period after the incident, the doors that were temporarily closed, the opportunities that did not materialize, were not accompanied by any explicit announcement. There was no decree. There was no public punishment. There didn't need to be. In Harlem's particular social ecosystem, when Bumpy Johnson was displeased with someone, the information propagated through the community the way information always propagated in Harlem, through the network of runners and barbers and doormen and churchwomen, through 1,000 small signals that accumulated into an unmistakable message. Frank Lucas had touched something he should not have touched, and the man whose thing he had touched had decided his fate. Now, here is where the story becomes genuinely complicated, because the fate Bumpy Johnson decided was not destruction. It was transformation. In the months and years after the incident, what emerged from the private confrontation between these two men was, by all accounts, a deeper and more formal relationship than had existed before. Lucas became, in a more explicit and committed way, a student of Bumpy Johnson, not merely an associate who absorbed lessons through proximity, but a man who had been brought to the edge of his own destruction and had been offered, instead of death, education. The men who witnessed this relationship develop from the outside found it remarkable. Here was a man who had committed one of the most serious possible offenses against Bumpy Johnson's family, and Bumpy had responded by drawing him closer, by making it clear, in the specific way that Bumpy communicated things, that the price of the offense was a debt, and that the debt could be paid in loyalty and in learning. This was, as it turned out, a far more profound punishment than violence would have been. Violence would have ended the story. What Bumpy chose instead was a story with no end, a relationship of obligation that Lucas would carry for the rest of his life. The relationship between Bumpy Johnson and Frank Lucas in the years following the 1958 incident is one of the most discussed and most disputed aspects of both men's biographies. Frank Lucas, in the interviews he gave over the decades following his own eventual arrest and imprisonment, spoke about Bumpy Johnson with an emotion that was clearly genuine and that went far beyond professional respect. He described Bumpy as a father figure, as a teacher, as the person who had made him into something more than the directionless young man he had been when he arrived in Harlem. These claims have been met with skepticism by some historians who note that Lucas was not always a reliable narrator of his own history, and that the Bumpy Johnson who appears in Lucas's accounts is sometimes suspiciously convenient, a legendary figure whose reflected glory enhances Lucas's own story. The actual documentary record of their relationship is thin, as it always is with relationships that were conducted entirely outside official channels. What we can say with confidence is this: Frank Lucas, over the course of the late 1950s and into the 1960s, developed into exactly the kind of criminal operator that Bumpy Johnson had spent decades modeling. He was disciplined. He was strategic. He was capable of restraint when restraint served his purposes and decisive when decisiveness was required. He understood the difference between power displayed and power exercised, a distinction that was absolutely central to Bumpy Johnson's philosophy. He also, by his own account, absorbed Bumpy's analysis of the fundamental structure of Harlem's criminal economy, and specifically Bumpy's frustration with that structure. Bumpy Johnson had negotiated an arrangement with the Italian families that preserved Harlem's territory in a formal sense, while simultaneously requiring that a percentage of Harlem's earnings flow upward to Italian mob management. This arrangement had been, from Bumpy's perspective, a pragmatic necessity, a deal struck under conditions of unequal power that had preserved more than it had sacrificed. But Bumpy never stopped seeing it as exactly what it was, a colonial arrangement. He had told people close to him, on multiple occasions, that the fundamental problem with Harlem's position in New York's organized crime ecosystem was that the neighborhood was producing wealth that it could not fully retain. The Italian families were intermediaries who extracted a tax for providing a kind of protection that Harlem, in a different world, would not have needed. Frank Lucas absorbed this analysis, and when the time came for him to build his own operation, after Bumpy Johnson's death in 1968, he built it specifically around the insight that Bumpy had spent 30 years articulating but had never been in a position to fully act on. Lucas's famous Blue Magic heroin operation, which brought product directly from Southeast Asia through military supply channels, bypassing the Italian mob's distribution infrastructure entirely, was not simply a logistical innovation. It was, in its fundamental design, the implementation of the lesson that Bumpy Johnson had been teaching for decades: cut out the intermediary. Build direct relationships with the source. Stop paying tribute to people whose only value is their ability to prevent you from accessing what you need. The irony, and it is a genuine, heavy irony, is that the operation Lucas built on these principles became one of the most destructive forces in Harlem's history. The heroin that flooded the neighborhood through Lucas's network in the early 1970s caused devastation on a scale that is almost impossible to reconcile with the image of Bumpy Johnson as Harlem's protector. Whether Bumpy would have approved of what Lucas built is a question that cannot be answered. Bumpy died in 1968, before Blue Magic existed, before the full catastrophe of the early 1970s heroin epidemic had unfolded. His own relationship with drug trafficking was complicated. He was convicted on narcotics charges, though he consistently maintained that the scale of his involvement was exaggerated. What is clear is that the man Bumpy Johnson made out of the young man who grabbed his wife on 7th Avenue in 1958 was someone capable of extraordinary things, and that extraordinary things in the world both men inhabited were not always distinguishable from catastrophic ones. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson died on July 7th, 1968, of heart failure at Wells Restaurant on 7th Avenue in Harlem, the same stretch of 7th Avenue where a decade earlier, a young man named Frank Lucas had made the most consequential mistake of his life. The symmetry was not lost on anyone who knew the story. Bumpy was 62 years old. He had spent more than 30 years as the central figure in Harlem's underground economy, had survived multiple prison terms, had negotiated with organized crime families that had tried to take everything he built, and had managed, through a combination of intelligence, restraint, and the kind of reputation that is earned over decades rather than purchased in moments, to maintain his position until the very end. His funeral drew thousands. Harlem shut down in the way it shuts down for people who have become part of its identity rather than merely its population. Businesses closed. Limousines lined the street. Politicians and musicians and church elders and street people stood together on the sidewalk, united by the specific shared experience of having lived in a neighborhood that Bumpy Johnson had, in his particular way, held together. Frank Lucas was reportedly among those who mourned. The grief Lucas expressed, then and in later accounts, was by all indications genuine. Whatever the complicated history between them, whatever the debt and obligation that had structured their relationship for a decade, Lucas understood that with Bumpy's death something fundamental about Harlem had changed. The man who had been the organizing principle of the neighborhood's underground economy was gone, and what came to fill that vacuum would be different in kind, not merely in degree. Lucas would spend the years immediately following Bumpy's death building the operation that would make him, by the early 1970s, one of the most powerful drug traffickers in New York City's history. The Blue Magic heroin, extraordinarily pure, sold at lower prices than the mob's product, distributed through a network that Lucas built from the ground up, generated revenues that have been estimated at anywhere from $100,000 to $1 million per day at its peak. The devastation this caused in Harlem and in black communities across the northeastern United States is a matter of documented record. The early 1970s heroin epidemic was one of the defining catastrophes of urban America, and Frank Lucas was among its chief architects. In 1975, Lucas was arrested by federal authorities. The investigation was led, in part, by a DEA task force that had been specifically targeting his operation. He was convicted on federal narcotics charges and sentenced to 70 years in prison. He eventually cooperated with federal authorities and had his sentence reduced, serving approximately 5 years in federal prison and additional time in state custody. He died in May 2019 at the age of 88. Mayme Johnson, the woman at the center of the story that bound these two men together, outlived both of them. She spent years after Bumpy's death working to preserve his legacy and correct what she saw as distortions in the public record. Distortions introduced by films and television programs that, in her view, got the texture of the man wrong even when they got the broad outlines right. She wrote and spoke extensively about Bumpy Johnson, and her accounts are among the most important primary sources we have for understanding the man behind the legend. She described a person of genuine complexity, capable of tenderness and brutality, of deep loyalty and calculated ruthlessness, of the kind of moral contradiction that exists in every human being, but that is particularly acute in people who have made the choices Bumpy made. The question that the story of the 1958 7th Avenue incident ultimately raises is not about crime or punishment or the specific dynamics of Harlem's underground economy. It is about something more fundamental. What does it mean to respond to an act of cruelty not with matching cruelty, but with something more lasting? Bumpy Johnson could have had Frank Lucas destroyed in 1958. By every convention of the world he operated in, that response would have been understood and accepted. The offense had been severe. The response could have been categorical. Instead, he chose to make Lucas understand, to make him carry the weight of what he had done, not as a scar, but as a lesson, to convert an enemy into something more complex, a debtor, a student, ultimately a kind of heir. Whether that choice was wise is a question history answers in complicated ways. The man Bumpy, made of Frank Lucas, went on to cause suffering at a scale that neither of them could have predicted in 1958. But the act itself, the decision to respond to cruelty not with rage, but with the patient, relentless application of consequence and instruction, tells you something essential about who Ellsworth Johnson was. He was a man who had grown up in a South Carolina city that tried to teach him he was nothing. He had built something in Harlem out of pure will and extraordinary intelligence. He had negotiated with the most powerful criminal organizations in America and held his ground. He had gone to prison twice and come back both times with his authority intact. And when a young man grabbed his wife on 7th Avenue, he responded the way Bumpy Johnson responded to every challenge in his life. Not by destroying it, but by absorbing it into the larger order he was always quietly constructing. Nobody who crossed Bumpy Johnson's family went untouched by what followed. The cruelty was answered. The account was settled, just not in the way anyone expected. That was always the way with Bumpy Johnson. He gave you exactly what you deserved, but he decided what you deserved, and he took all the time he needed to decide it correctly. Harlem has not forgotten him. Harlem never forgets the people who held it together when everything else was trying to tear it apart. And on 7th Avenue, where all of this began, in the long shadow of Wells Restaurant, where Bumpy ate his last meal, where the neighborhood came to see him and be seen by him, His memory persists in the way that only certain kinds of memory can persist. Not as nostalgia, not as myth, as truth.